encourage everyone again, would love to use the chat. So if you can add your name, your city, and your role to the chat, it'll make it for a more interactive session. And therefore, when you ask your questions, we'll know which city you're from. My name is Jamie Lavin, and I lead the local infrastructure hub on behalf of Bloomberg Philanthropies. This session is brought to you by our amazing partners, the United States Conference of Mayors and Results for America. And before we get to today's topic, I just want to give a heartfelt congratulations to all of the cities who last week won Reconnecting Communities Neighborhood Access and SMART Awards. We're so excited for you. We can't wait to follow your projects and see how they really help transform your communities, and especially with the SMART program, pilot new technologies and help us all learn together. It's a fun program. For those cities, and many of them are ones that we supported and helped with applications who weren't successful in funding, we want to continue to be there every step of the way. And so we're here to help you think about how you reapply for next year's cycle of funding. We also are here to help you think more broadly about other ways to fund your really important projects. So today we're here to discuss the many funding opportunities for reducing or eliminating greenhouse gas emissions from fleets that are available under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. We're going to hear from policy experts about how to stack and combine multiple funding streams, the characteristics of successful applications, and the types of projects that are eligible for funding. We'll also be joined by some city officials to share more about how their cities are approaching electric fleet transitions, what are the best practices, and what are those lessons that they learned because it wasn't so easy. As always, as I've said before, we want this to be an interactive session, so I'm going to encourage you to post your questions, your insights, what your city is doing. If you have a link to your city's plan, put it in the chat. We all learn better when we learn together. We're going to get to as many questions as possible. We've built in lots of Q&A time. So first, I want to welcome our first speaker. I had the pleasure of getting to see Paul Kincaid, who is the Associate Administrator for Communications and Congressional Affairs at the Federal Transit Administration last week at the National League of Cities Conference. And we're just so delighted to have Paul with us today to talk about some of these funding programs. So Paul, thank you for joining us, and the Zoom is yours.
Thank you, Jamie. I appreciate it. I'm just reading the chat on the side here. Was in campaign world, what seems like a lifetime ago, and so looking for cities I might have lived in. It's great to be here to get a chance to talk to all of y'all about what the United States Department of Transportation, particularly the Federal Transit Administration, is doing as far as electrifying and creating zero emission opportunities for transit fleets, specifically for my shop, but also across the board to meet the president's deadline of a zero net emission country by 2050. And let me introduce myself. As Jamie noted, my name is Paul Kincaid. I'm the Associate Administrator of the Federal Transit Administration. I'm in charge of communications and congressional affairs. And along with our acting administrator and senior advisor, and one of 3 Biden-Harris appointees here at FTA. So we have an amazing team of around 750 career staff that are doing a lot of good work across our country, both here in Washington, D.C. and in 10 regional offices around the country. And there are 3 of us who come from the president's administration. So mine will be an outlook that's a little tinged by what's in the White House, but also proud to work with all the people here who are doing such a great job to fulfill our mission of moving America's communities ahead through public transportation. Right now, our major focus around zero emission vehicles is on our zero emission bus grant. It's the low and no emission bus grant. It's been on the street for a while. It's along with our bus and bus facilities grants, which can be used for zero emission vehicles, but also for the infrastructure to charge them, as well as for traditionally powered internal combustion engine vehicles and their infrastructure. Right now, the notice of funding opportunity that we have on the street is worth about $1.6 billion, and that's for both grants combined. The low and no emission program used to be what was known as a pilot project, but it had been around for a number of years, I believe for at least 5 or 6 years before the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law was created. And it was about $300 million. And we found that it was tremendously oversubscribed, and it still is, which is wonderful. It's by a factor of 3 or 4 now instead of 10 or 15, which is it's still a great sign that there is a massive interest in transitioning bus fleets from internal combustion engines or from diesel specifically to hybrid or to zero emission fleets. So for the last 2 years, we've had about $1.6 billion each year to spend on buses. And through that, we've funded about 3,000 new zero emission vehicles. And all of those are going to be built here in the United States using American parts and American labor. That's thanks to the Buy American provisions that I know a lot of you are probably familiar with, and in some cases don't exactly love. But for this program and for many like it throughout the U.S. Department of Transportation, it's reinvigorating the American manufacturing sector. President Biden has added twice as many manufacturing jobs as there were when he got here. In our case, last year we funded 1,700 new American-built buses across 46 states and territories where projects will be built, and we expect to do very similar this year. So our hope is to have somewhere around 7,000 American-built zero-emission buses by the time the bipartisan infrastructure law is finished. And I'll talk a little bit about why that's important in a couple minutes. But the notice of funding opportunity ends on April 25th. It is the only bill or the only part of our legislation that we're actually required to do in a certain time frame. So once the NOFO application period ends, we have 75 days to make our project selections. So we expect to get this funding out and on the street very quickly after the 25th of April, and we're looking forward to it. It is of our discretionary grant programs that are competitive, it's the largest one by a pretty wide margin that we offer each year. We have the capital investment grants that are technically competitive, they're discretionary, but they're not competitive in quite the same way. You compete with yourself to make sure that you can check off all the boxes that you need to on the way to a large project. The bus grants are more traditionally competitive. One of the reasons that's important is because it allows us to look at the industry and to look at transit as a whole and start to put priorities into the notice funding opportunities. Obviously, we talked about climate and the issue with zero emission vehicles and the focus that the administration has had on that. Of course, we also have focused very much on equity. Our administrator who just left, Nuria Fernandez, was very fond of saying that transit is the great equalizer. When the doors open, you can get on, and when they open again, you can be practically anywhere. And it doesn't matter how much you make, it doesn't matter what your skin color is, it doesn't matter the zip code you were born in, everyone's got an equal chance. And so it's one of the reasons I love working here is that transit gets started very high on the equity ladder already, but we're still very focused on making sure that all of the money that we spend comports with the president's Justice 40 provisions, which is the concept that 40% of new spending on climate and environmental concerns needs to be spent in underprivileged and previously marginalized communities. And so we take a good look at that. But this year, we're in a little bit of a different situation. The bus industry in this country is at a bit of a pivot point that we've seen in a lot of industries throughout the country. And it is that after COVID and after some of the supply chain issues that came along with it, the production and procurement of American buses has changed a little bit. And so there's been a few companies that have left the market, and we're very hopeful that there will be more that come into the market given the massive investment that the bipartisan infrastructure law has made. But we also want to make that as easy as possible, and we want to make it as easy as possible to get more buses on the road faster, giving more people rides to more places. And so in the notice of funding opportunity we put on the streets a couple weeks ago, there's a very specific provision that indicates what we're going to look at as our primary kind of goal in sending this money out to communities across America. And that's making sure that that goal of those buses hitting the ground early and often is achieved. And so our priority consideration this year will be to ensure that the bus manufacturers are getting orders that are as stable as possible and as devoid of customization as possible. We're encouraging agencies and cities to work between themselves with multiple cities or multiple communities coming together in one grant application or one set of procurement to build buses that are similar. I was talking on the pre-call a little bit. I'm from Florida originally, and I saw a few folks from Florida on the line. There's not a lot of hills in Florida. I think our highest mountain is 37 feet tall. There's very similar needs as far as topography. There's very similar needs as far as weather. There's very similar needs pretty much across the board. And so my hometown of Orlando If it was procuring buses, we would love for them to work with places like Ocala and Daytona Beach and Tampa to say, okay, we're all buying buses. We're all interested in this bus grant. Let's work together and get, instead of each of us getting 50 of a different bus, let's get 250 of the same bus and divide it out between us. That sort of joint procurement is what we're looking for and what we're going to look at as a priority consideration. We also want to make sure that where possible, agencies are providing progress payments for bus manufacturers. The bus manufacturing process is taking a little longer now than it used to. We're closer to 2 to 3 years to get a zero emission bus out rather than 18 to 24 months, which it was before COVID. Some of that is related to supply chain. Some of it's related to customization. Every time a new bus gets built, there has to be a lot of engineering done to get it planned. And we find that the average bus order is about 8 to 10 buses. So every 8 to 10 buses, a factory is having to re-engineer its assembly line. So that's taking a little bit longer to produce the vehicles. So those two things kind of combined, the idea of the financial ability of agencies to help transit vehicle manufacturers get buses moving faster, and the concept of less customization resulting in faster assembly line engineering and faster production, we think will mean a lot more bang for the taxpayer buck. We'll get more buses out faster into communities and rolling down the streets. And again, helping to build American jobs. The more we order, the more those factories are gonna need to hire folks. And we know they have capacity left. It's just they need to be in a place where making the bus is a little bit easier and is a little bit more financially smart. And so that's kind of what we're doing from a notice of funding opportunity standpoint. Across the board, I know at the beginning, Jamie talked a little bit about how we're moving to a zero emission transportation future. And it's something we have to do, right? Because transportation is the single largest emitting sector in our nation. And while transit is a very energy and emissions efficient means of transportation, we can do better. We know that diesel buses put a lot of greenhouse gases into the air, so we can move to either hybrid or zero emission. We can get more people on electrified trains. We can get more people on electrified ferries, which we actually have $50 million through the bipartisan infrastructure law to build pilot zero emission ferries. And right now, 2 of them are under construction at a shipyard in Rhode Island. And we're looking very much forward to riding on those when they come out. But what we don't often talk about, and probably should, is it's not just about the vehicles. It's also about the people. There are a lot of transit workers who were frontline heroes during COVID. They took first responders, they took hospital workers, they took food store workers, and other incredibly important employees to and from work. They took people to shopping that could otherwise not get there. They did a tremendous amount, and the COVID relief funds saved 50,000 of their jobs in the process. So we kept a lot of people at work. Now there's a new transition. It's not a pandemic. Instead, it's this concept of moving from emitting buses and other vehicles to zero emission buses and other vehicles. Along with that comes new skills. And so as part of the low emission bus grant program, if you get a zero emission bus grant to move to hydrogen fuel cell or to battery electric or to any other zero emission technology, 5% of your grant has to be spent on workforce training. And that's the idea that, again, we're bringing everyone along for the ride. It's training mechanics to become technicians and electricians instead. It's training the folks who work on the brakes to all of a sudden now work on brakes that also help charge batteries. It's doing all those things that transitioning to zero emission will require. And the good thing is, thanks to Congress and thanks to the policies here at FTA, this isn't saying we're going to give you a grant and you have to take 5% off the top, and so you can't spend as much on buses. If you know you're going to get a zero emission bus grant or you're going after one and you're looking for $10 million to buy 10 buses, you can request $10,500,000. And we're entirely fine with that 5% that's required for transition planning to come off that 500,000, and you still spend all the money that you need on those zero emission buses. We know that for a lot of communities, local match is tough to find, and so we don't want to add any more requirements to that local match funding in order to transfer your fleet from internal combustion engine to zero emission. We've got some great stories that we've already heard of agencies across the country. I know Houston is doing an amazing job with some junior colleges and and the unions that they work with down in Texas to move employees or their employees across the board, whether it's drivers or mechanics, to zero emission. There's great stories of programs that are working with junior colleges and with four-year schools, as well as high schools across the country, to start to, number one, teach the folks who are already working how to transition to a zero emission future, but also how to bring new workers into the transit industry. The transit workforce was damaged badly by COVID. We lost a lot of great operators, both through COVID, but also through early retirement. And so a lot of agencies across the country have very aggressive workforce building plans that will train and retain all of the workers that they possibly can to make sure that they're operating their schedules and their routes at full capacity. Along with the workforce development is another part of transition, and that's ensuring that not just your agency is ready to transition from emission to zero emission, but the folks around you are as well, particularly things like utility companies. We found in some instances that utility companies were charging full retail rates for overnight charging of buses that they otherwise couldn't get. And so there were discussions that needed to be had between transit agencies and the utility companies to say, look, these folks are pulling greenhouse gas emissions out of the air. They're running bus service. It's going to take cars off the road. Full retail, service is not what you should be charging them. You should be, in a cooperative sort of state of being where they're getting good rates to do the good work they're doing. So there's a lot of parts of that transition process that FTA is excited to be helping to smooth out. We also have a great cooperative agreement with the Transit Workforce Center in Maryland, where we're funding them for the 5 years of the bipartisan infrastructure law so that they can help agencies transition their workforce. They can help agencies put together a fleet transition plan that includes things like working with third-party stakeholders like electric agencies. So we're doing a lot with a tremendous amount of investment through the bipartisan infrastructure law. It's the largest investment in the history of American transit. And obviously, we are very hopeful that will continue. This bill runs through 2026. And obviously, as the next Congress begins, it's likely that some more discussions will be had. In order for those discussions to lead to an even better bill next time, we need to make sure that all of you know exactly how to take advantage of the bipartisan infrastructure law that we have right now. So I talked a little bit about the notice of funding opportunity with the bus grants. We have a program called the DOT Navigator. Very much recommend that you Google it whenever you get a chance to. It will show you every notice of funding opportunity that's expected for the entire United States Department of Transportation and its programs. It will show you when those are expected to come out, when the grants are expected to come out, and most importantly, what you need to do to get ready to apply. And what Jamie was talking about with those notice of funding opportunities is really important, because I can't stress enough the importance of reading the notice of funding opportunities and really focusing on their requirements and their requests. As I mentioned earlier, we have very specific priority considerations with our bus grants. If you show that you are, minimizing customization and working hard to make it financially more stable for the bus procurement, we're going to give you an advantage. But by the same token, if you're doing that but you don't show it, we can't give you those priority considerations, and it'll be more difficult for your application to compete in what is a vastly oversubscribed program. And so knowing where those notice of funding opportunities are in the Federal Register, knowing when they're going to come out so that you've got the best chance possible to put an application together, go back through that notice of funding opportunity and make sure that your application fully comports with everything that it asks for, is absolutely critical. My final plug, and then I think I'm probably over, but my final plug, and then I'm happy to take questions, is focus on your local relationships as much as you possibly can through the United States Department of Transportation. I talked about our regional offices. We have 10 of them across the country. They are your DOT in your region. Our FHWA, Federal Highways friends have an agency in every single state, a division office. Make sure you know who they are, that you formed relationships with them. The questions that you likely have that are related to your projects or related to funding or related to kind of what you're doing in your state, will be vastly or better answered by folks who are actually around you and who do this as a day-to-day thing. I talked to Jamie and said, I'm a generalist. I'm a mile wide and an inch deep, and every once in a while I'll find a couple things I know about. But the administrative folks or the regional office folks in your regions are the exact opposite. They know an unbelievable amount about your regions, about the projects there, about what projects have come before them, about the policies and procedures of USDOT, things like NEPA, which is incredibly important to really know about anytime you're starting a project, because from the very beginning, you have to comply with NEPA in order to receive federal funds. So we've got that information on our website. You can look at highways, you can look at pipelines, you can look at the Federal Railroad Administration and find their local contacts. Very, very much recommend having as good a relationship as possible with those folks, and they'll be your conduits to getting everything that you can from the bipartisan infrastructure law, from the Inflation Reduction Act, and from everything else that we have out there, whether it's through us, through the Department of Energy, through the Department of Commerce, or the EPA. So, Jamie, did I hit everything?
That was great. Thank you so much, Paul.
Sure.
I just have to say, Paul touched on it, and I just want to emphasize, I feel like we have just incredible partners at the U.S. Department of Transportation who really are trying to make this process as easy as possible. Now, that said, I don't think anyone thinks it's easy, right? And so checking out resources that we put in the chat, like the checklist, the DOT Navigator. I know there's, folks who've just been really trying to think like local administrators and local governments think about what would I want to know? How would I want to navigate this process? And so we do encourage you to check those out. We don't have a ton of time for questions. We can get to at least two that the audience has asked. And if there's anything we haven't covered, we'll follow up with everyone or try to cover it in our city panel. Matt is a pro moderator and always sort of takes into account what didn't get answered. I think the first one that we received was about how a city transit system for which they currently own CNG buses, but contract out for drivers and maintenance. As they look to transition to electric, they're giving some thought as to whether the city should procure its own buses or if they should seek out a contract that would include use of others' electric buses. Any thoughts on that, Paul, about how that partnership piece really should work?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult because one of the things that is focused on in a lot of the ways that we get funding and move it out to communities is FTA is constrained a great deal on local decisions and in even making specific recommendations on things like routes or the type of vehicle to use or things like that. We actually are not allowed to, we don't set fares. We aren't allowed to address fares really. We can't say you should buy electric buses or you should buy CNG buses. I mean, we can give the money out that kind of indicates that, but we can't expressly say it. So it isn't something that we've studied a lot here in Washington. But again, I would recommend reaching out to our Region 9 office. They're located in Los Angeles and San Francisco. They can talk to you about what's been done in other communities. I know a lot of agencies and a lot of cities, including here in Washington, D.C., in some capacities, have contracted out drivers, and some have contracted out maintenance as well. I'm not sure what the rules would be as far as our grants, though. I believe you have to be an FTA recipient in order to get a grant. And so there are not a lot of contract agencies that are FTA recipients. Matter of fact, I don't believe there are any. So that might make it a little more difficult. Again, that's a question you really need to ask the region, because I think they would be able to kind of better understand how you're procuring vehicles. But our grants are primarily to purchase vehicles, not to lease. And so that's one kind of shortcoming that might be there. Obviously, as a mid-sized town, it may be more economically viable for you to lease the vehicles as well as to contract out all of the maintenance and driving. I don't know what those numbers look like, though. I can say our match on electric vehicles is 85% federal share and 15% local, which is a great deal. It's actually less local share than our internal combustion engine grants are. So it is a really good opportunity to procure vehicles yourself but I would definitely recommend reaching out to our Region 9 office to kind of get their thoughts and maybe some examples from that region.
Great. And maybe the last question we're going to get to right now, but I promise those other questions we'll address later, is from Casey Shevlin, just asking about the grant cycle. We know the bipartisan infrastructure law, several of the programs for 5-year. Where are we in the low-no cycle, and how many more years of funding do we have left?
So the bipartisan infrastructure law was signed on November 15th of 2021. So about 2 months into fiscal year 22. Although I don't believe we actually had fiscal year 22 funding yet because, Congress does its thing. So we gave out the fiscal year 22 grants, the 23 grants, and now we're on 24. So we have 2 more fiscal years. This grant program normally opens relatively soon after the beginning of the year, depending on kind of what the funding structure looks like. We do have a tremendous benefit, and this is getting super inside baseball, so I apologize. Some of our grants are held in the part of our funding structure that just got solved through the omnibus appropriations bill that passed a couple weeks ago that funded US DOT and several other federal agencies until September of this year, the end of September. Our bus grants, particularly the low and no emission bus grants, are primarily funded through what's called advanced appropriations, which is a new sort of way of funding things that was done through the bipartisan infrastructure law. So for the bus grants, for our all stations accessibility program, for the rail car replacement program, a bunch of the new stuff that was created in the bipartisan infrastructure law, we have what is not totally secure funding, but pretty secure funding until FY26, which is when the bipartisan infrastructure law expires. So we have 2 more years where we know we're getting at least $1.05 billion to do the zero emission bus grants. And the other 500 million or the other 450 million is incredibly likely. So those grants should be on the street toward the beginning of next year. They'll close usually about 60 days after they open, and then they'll do the grants about 75 days later. So yeah, all that to say, 2 more cycles after this one. We hope to put 7,000 new American built buses on the road thanks to that.
Thank you so much, Paul. We really appreciate you sharing your insights today. And we encourage everyone to apply for this program. And what we've heard in a lot of other sessions is sometimes it takes several bites of the apple. So encourage you to apply, get some feedback from folks like Paul at FTA, or the program folks, maybe.
I was going to say, don't get feedback from me.
Don't get feedback from Paul. And to come back and to apply again. Thank you so much, Paul. We're gonna shift now and hear about some cities who have ambitious plans to electrify their fleets and who are putting these programs into action. And so I'm gonna hand it over to my partner, Matt Stevens-Rich at the Electrification Coalition. As many of you know, the Electrification Coalition has been supporting this work for a long time and is really our subject matter experts on the local infrastructure hub that we turn to on all things electrification. So thank you for joining us, Matt, and the Zoom is yours.
Awesome. Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, great seeing everyone and appreciate folks tuning in. There's definitely a lot going on, so we're going to cover a lot of gamut here. But let me quickly introduce our city panel speakers. Really excited actually to have a good cohort. It's both some cities that we at the EC have had the pleasure to work with through previous Bloomberg funded programming and a couple new faces too. So I'm personally excited just to dig into it. But just to do a quick round the horn. So we're joined today by Mayor Bruce Teague of Iowa City, Iowa. One thing actually to Iowa that I will just gladly bump, there's a lot of amazing electrification work afoot across many cities in the Midwest, and Iowa has actually been really leading the way through a lot of that. So really excited to hear from Mayor Teague. We're also joined by Lan Rao, who is with the Transit Division Manager for Colorado Springs, Colorado. Going back to a lot of our previous conversation around transit, and especially what does that look like in our more rocky states as well as colder weather. And then finally, Mayor Ron Nirenberg with City of San Antonio. We had the pleasure to work with San Antonio at the EC through the Bloomberg American Cities Climate Challenge. And in turn, the city's been continuing on a lot of awesome foray, both on the fleet and broader climate mitigation sides. So as we bring them on to the panel phase here, please do keep questions coming in the chat. I'll keep an eye out for them and have a couple other ones prepared too for our panelists as we go. But tell you what, let's start with Mayor Nurnberg. I'll kind of call on you first. I actually was just emailing with some of your sustainability team on some IRA tax incentives that you guys are looking at around fleet electrification. But wanted to pick your brain on a lot of folks tuning in today. They're looking at different resources, different intel on what grants to go after or how to develop their projects. What do you find as help in leading your city team as you look at new and ambitious projects? What resources do you find helpful, be it as mayor overseeing the team, or in turn, what does your sustainability management team need from you for moving forward on projects?
Well, thank you very much, Matt. Good to be with Mayor Teague as well, and our panelist, Rao. I'll just start by saying that the challenge in San Antonio when it comes to climate and emissions is a challenge of scale. And so the first thing that they need from leadership is really persistence of vision. We have 5,400 vehicles in a fleet across 27 different city departments. And so when we first began the effort to electrify our fleet, it became almost a problem unsolvable when you think about just the size of what we're trying to transition. Not to mention the fact that here in the state of Texas, the state government has created headwinds against our transition. So what we have done is really scour every opportunity to work with DOT and EPA and other federal departments to find resources to begin the steps in that transition. We have a climate action plan that is fully implementable and economically viable, and we are taking steps in that direction. First thing to do on that front, though, is to understand the challenge. 38% of our emissions are created by our transportation sector here in the city of San Antonio. So due to years of redlining and disinvestment in public transit, generations of San Antonians have been ushered into a very car-centric city. It's a sprawling city of 500 square miles, not very dense. So we're working to unwind all that, and we're close to breaking ground, not just in the fleet transition, but also on the first ever mass transit system in the city of San Antonio. 2 advanced rapid transit lines, and working on our first transit-oriented development policy. It's going to take time, though, again, because of the scale. And in the interim, as we begin to build out that advanced rapid transit system, we're also working diligently to transition the fleet. In our analysis, even accounting for upstream emissions like battery production and delivery, EVs account for 45% less emissions over their lifespan than traditional gas and diesel vehicles. And in that same analysis, we were able to determine that accounting for lifetime emissions, total cost of operating and EV infrastructure, both current and future, 1,200 vehicles are ready to be replaced right this moment, with the largest vehicles yielding obviously the most immediate benefit. We have already transitioned a quarter of those vehicles. They're being replaced by models currently cheaper than their current gas and diesel counterparts. We've begun replacing those vehicles since 2021, and I'm happy to say that 77 are all electric plug-in hybrid vehicles, and an additional 25 are all electric vehicles that are pending delivery. The acquisition of 40 more EVs is planned for FY25, and we're on target to exceed our goals of 110 in that year. Our current charging station inventory includes 65 EV charging ports for fleet use at various city facilities. And our current year budget, our FY24 budget, advances the EV infrastructure plan by including $620,000 for upgraded electrical infrastructure and facilitation of EV chargers for fleet use at various city facilities. Finally, I'd say that 90% of our city's administrative sedan fleet, those cars that just roam around, is comprised of hybrid EV, plug-in hybrid electric, or all electric vehicles. So we are very proud of that progress. We're going to continue to make it. And we're also working on the policy front. I don't want to leave out policy is important in terms of future planning. We became the first city in Texas to require level 2 EV charging in all new home construction. So it's really a all hands on deck battle on all fronts in EV infrastructure and EV transition in San Antonio, from our transit system all the way to new home construction.
No, I really appreciate that, and definitely the city's been busy, especially leading the way. Mayor Teague, for Iowa City, how has your general fleet process been going? And maybe in that broader context too, about how it fits into your broader climate mitigation planning.
Well, I'm super excited to be here with everyone today. So thanks for having this talk and opportunity of just to get some real life lessons, I guess, as we have navigated through this process of one, trying to be more conscientious of our world around us and what can we do. In 2019 is when our city declared a climate crisis. And we really tasked 100 days for a plan to come into place for us to address it. And we said by 2050, we're going to have zero net emissions. And so that was, that was a big deal. And we even said by 2030 is when we
let me
want
hit
to
you
see.
back because Mark's up here working on my phone. I'm having some problems.
We wanted to see by 2030 a 45% reduction. And so that was a very progressive goal, I think, by the council, but many of you might know that this day and age, when people run for elections, climate action is a part of their talking points of what they want to do. And so we had a council that was really motivated to put the pen to the paper and really set our projection on where we were going. And so fast forward a little bit, because we wanted to have electric fleet a part of our city, we had a study done, and the city paid for that out of our own funds. But that study really allowed us to take a step back and figure out how are we going to ensure that we achieve this goal. And you're really looking at the infrastructure of all the components. So you look at the fleet transition plan, the daily charging needs, and then also there's the staffing component, because if a vehicle is sitting for, not being used every day, you have to stop and ask, why is that? And so we wanted to make sure that we had roll out a schedule of who uses the vehicles when, so that we can maximize on that. And then also the charging stations is going to be a big part of it. And so we wanted to have one in our police department. And when we looked at how many can we get in there, we only had a max of 2 vehicles that we can have in there because of and maxed out the electrical panels. So there's a lot of things that can really go into the planning that I think is just critical. Like I mentioned, we by 2030 have this 45 reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by then, and I'll tell you that we've kind of reached that already because of our Mid-American Energy partner. They have 100% clean energy, renewable energy as of last year, and so that's a huge step in helping us. And now we're at a road where we are all in. We have to make sure that residents and the city, we all do our parts. I really appreciated the mayor talking about the construction component where there's a requirement for them to have EV charging stations in their home. A lot of our activities with our residents are really surrounding what can you do to really help us reach this goal. And oftentimes we think about, we just need everybody to get in an electric vehicle. And I'm not saying that that's not our end goal, but I want to say that there's a lot of things that people can do now. So really insulating their home is a major thing that folks can do. And I think that's where we kind of missed the target a little bit. And in our city, we do have some funding available for that. What I would also say is that transportation accounts for 22% of our emissions citywide and 15%, on our just on our municipal buildings. And so we're really looking at how can we make that impact. And we're grateful for the funding that we've received because it's going to help us get more electric buses. And the other thing that I will say is that making sure that we're maintaining those relationships with our local, with our federal delegations, because it's important that as a community, when we're trying to go and do our best at ensuring that we do all to reduce the emissions, that people are aware of our local things that we're doing. Really, to speak to what Paul was talking about, the infrastructure bill, sharing our stories is going to be critical. And I just wanted to also mention that for the city of Iowa City, we do have fare-free transit. I know this is off the topic a little bit, but I wanted to mention that because that's something that we did as a pilot program last year. And it's a 2-year pilot program. And we're about to unveil our plans to actually turn that from a pilot program into something that will be here for as long as I will be in office, let's hope. So I'll end there, but thanks for this opportunity.
No, that's perfect segue, Mayor Teague, and appreciate the perspective to Lon. Yeah, actually, keep it on the transit element, Lon, as that's a little bit more so of your realm of the world. How are things going in Colorado, especially as you guys look at general fleet planning and the data tracking as you work towards metrics?
Yeah, thank you, Matt. My name's Lan Rao, Transit Services Division Manager for the City of Colorado Springs. I'm very honored to share some of our experiences here with this panel on behalf of our Mayor, Yami Mobolade. Maybe a little background of who we are. We are a division of City of Colorado Springs, so we are part of a city government, but at the same time, we're providing a regional service within the regional, the Pikes Peak area. We have about 70 fixed route buses, 49 vehicles, combination of minivans and cutaway vans providing ADA, complimentary paratransit service, and we also have a small fleet for van pool. We are fortunate that we were able to recover about 90% of our ridership last year compared to pre-COVID. I believe our sized agency in the nation, the average was about 71%. So we're very happy to report that. Our budget for 2024 is $53 million. Of that, $39 million was for operating and $14 million in CIP programs. So that's a quick overview. We are considered in the FTA world a large urban area agency, but really in the whole APTA, when you look at transit agencies across the nation, we're considered more around that mid-sized agency. So we provide the infrastructure such as buildings and buses for our contractors to operate and maintain our vehicles. So that's a little, I think it's not uncommon in the transit world, but not every agency operates 100% outsourced service. We submitted a grant application in 2023 under the low-no application, and we were awarded about $3.2 million to purchase 6 electric hybrid vehicles. And with this funding, we're able to replace 6 very old diesel buses in our fleet. There are a lot of sections in the grant application. If your staff member is working on those grant applications, you will see there's section 1, section 2, and these seem daunting at first. But what we took out of those grant application, all the requirements are really, you know, that's our interpretation. Paul, correct me if I'm wrong. What we got out of that is really the FTA is looking for a solid plan, a very thoughtful plan that we need to be able to demonstrate. Do we have good staff managing the money? Are we going to sit on the funding if we were awarded? How do we plan to spend the money? And how is this funding really improving, addressing a need that we have in our community and really benefit the riders? So we were able to address those sections in the grant application, and a lot of the questions are really, they make sense. For example, I think Paul mentioned there are requirements for local match, and we were able to, instead of putting in 5, 10, or 20% local match, we were able to program 40% local match in our grant application to demonstrate a strong need and our desire to put those money to good use. We feel that it is important to have a good planning process in place. We introduced our first round of battery electric buses in 2022, early 2022. We purchased 4 battery electric buses from Proterra. Unfortunately, the company went through a bankruptcy process, and we, combined with the supply chain problems nationwide, we were caught in the middle of that issue. So there are a lot of struggles that we went through, and we're still living in that struggle on a daily basis. So we feel that it is important to take small bites. For the hybrid transition, we started with the 6 hybrid vehicles and see how it goes. And then we can learn from our experience. Take it slow, do small pilots. And also we're taking this as an opportunity to introduce and diversify our fleet. As in Colorado, we actually experienced this last couple months with cold weather. Our diesel buses wouldn't start. We had issues with chargers, and the gas engine cutaway vans were working just fine. So it is sometimes scary to consider a mixed fleet, but that diversification would be extremely beneficial for the community when we need that reliability to provide the service. So that's a quick recap of what we have, and I'll hand over back to you, Matt.
No, that's actually a perfect next question I had for the group was really identifying any challenges or overcoming barriers. So Lan, you kind of hit it right on the nose of fleet diversification as a part of the Colorado Springs approach, allowing you to be testing out the equipment, make sure it's able to be meeting the best fit, and then also thinking about the scaling. And actually, I'll weave another question from the group on unexpected budget expenses. So maybe as a broader, just as we've been going down this path of broader fleet electrification and really looking at scaling that solution, how have collective teams, be it at city level or even broader regional partners, been identifying those barriers and working through mitigation? And if the answer to is just we're continuing to keep an eye on it, especially around procurement elements, that's always a welcome perspective too. But maybe I'll call on you, Mayor Nirenberg, on thoughts on the San Antonio front.
Yeah, well, thanks, Matt. I'll be honest with you. The barriers that we've encountered in the EV transition process have been mostly internal. The idea that we would be transitioning at all from a political perspective from some corners of the community, but also not going fast enough from others. So the other challenge externally that we've encountered, as Lan said, is supply chain related. We've mostly overcome that. So we're pushing as quickly as we can. Naturally, because of the pace of our transition, we do, I would say, benefit in some ways from the diversification issue that Lan also spoke about. In hindsight, sometimes being deliberate about our transitions of these things have been beneficial to us. So some minor challenges, but nothing that is out of the ordinary or unexpected.
No, I appreciate it. Mayor Teague, what about for Iowa City?
Yeah, so we actually contracted out for our fleet transition study. And that tool really helped us identify the infrastructure needs that we need in place, really for the power requirements. And honestly, to entertain how many vehicles, we can garner. And wanted to also be ready for the opportunities that would arise, because the fleet transition study is also a requirement to have that in place, which I find very beneficial. And as I mentioned before, that electrical panel, when we, wanted to get two police cars, well, more than two police cars that were electrified, but we could only get two because of the panel. And so just having that information is going to be critical. The other thing that I think, as we began to think about, electrifying our fleet, but there are non-road vehicles, which in my opinion is some low-hanging fruit. So lawnmowers, trimmers, forklifts, floor sweepers, those are things that we also did think about. And then the last thing I will mention is a staff. So we have different departments, and not every department has the same appetite for EVs. And so I think making sure that we have conversations with those departments to learn what their appetite is. I do a little education as well. For instance, I know that our public works, their vehicles would be huge. And when we had snow days here in Iowa City, this year, I think we had over 20 feet of snow within like 2 days. Well, if we were to do a vehicle that would remove the snow, we run those vehicles 24/7. Well, we would have to have pause for the vehicle to go and be charged. And so those are some considerations that we might want to think about. But our Parks and Rec, they're all about it, as well as our refuse department, because there are some vehicles out there. So again, I think it is very critical to talk to staff, make sure that we're educating them on what we're doing, and making sure that we have a good transition plan in place.
No, that's great, and that's really excellent to hear about your planning process overall to really make sure that you were hitting the mark. Looks like Jamie dropped the link to your report as well in the chat. As I go into last round of question here, there's going to be a poll that comes up, so I do ask folks go ahead and work through that. But maybe as a good final question, because overall it's really helpful hearing these different perspectives across literal different geographic regions, different scale of vehicles. One thing that does feel like unifies here is everyone is really set on that target, that ambition to whatever goal was set, be it for the region, for the city. I guess curious, how is it going on tracking that metric? As we work a lot with cities for a 2030 goal, a 2035, 2030 unfortunately comes sooner than not. So there's indeed that focus of how are we being sure we're staying on target, or if not, what's our elements for getting up to speed on that? So I get curious, and Lan, maybe I'll go to you first. What you actually gave some great perspective on just tracking vehicle operation, but what other key metrics are you tracking, and especially as a regional transit operator?
We track a lot. I think for every transit agency, you can echo that. It comes back to how you define the success of transit. Is it ridership alone? Is it efficiency, ridership per hour? Is it the coverage, how many days you run a service, and is it 24/7 operations? We have a lot of plans as well. So what we do is I think it's really important. Actually, our mayor has shared this strategic doing philosophy with the entire city staff. I think it is really important to keep in mind that we have a plan in place, or we have multiple plans in place, but really be agile enough to revisit the plan and be willing to adjust and change your action or what you're doing in order to respond to this ever-changing environment. So I think that's probably a quick summary of how we respond.
Well, you mentioned the plan. I guess Mayor Teague, knowing you have a great looking plan in place, have any feeling on how to revisit that, or maybe using that in your ongoing process of procurement deployment to that metric tracking element?
Yeah, I do think it's critical to track the data, right? And as it was just mentioned, it can be ridership, it can be various things. And so for us, we have smart chargers, and so we can get data from that software. Also, I think just from the vehicles itself, if we're doing total miles, on electricity versus gas, what that costs. And also, when you're looking at the maintenance, there is huge, data that you can garner from there, because once you go to an full electric vehicle, there is no oil changes, no spark plugs, no catalytic converters, no, I mean, it just changes that cost. And I know for us, that savings will be over $5 million once we electric our vehicles. But again, I think that is something that data is important for us to maintain.
No, that's a great point. And that's not just dollars saved, that's tax revenue saved and allowed to be spent on other projects. Mayor Nierenberg, I'll give you the last word. Anything else in addition to share on tracking?
Yeah, I think obviously the gold standard for us in all of these transitions would be GHG and emissions overall. And we're still a growing city, so it's a little frustrating sometimes to see that it has leveled off. It not necessarily have declined as fast as we would like it, but it's beginning to. But I think Mayor Teague hit it. Like we have to make sure that we put metrics out in front of the public that are completely understandable and everyone can relate to and appreciate. And those invariably are the economic ones. When it comes to saving money per vehicle mile traveled, on maintenance, fuel costs, downstream waste impacts, all those point to EV and low emitting vehicles and encourage us on the transition. So underscore all the things that were said, but bottom line is people need to understand it for its economic sense.
Well, I appreciate so much of all three of our panelists' times. Thank you, mayors. Thank you, Len, for joining and providing such great diverse perspective. And I guess as the last bump to that, all the things that we're pointing to, references, resource, that can all be found back on the local infrastructure hub as well. In addition to, there's actually some additional links that have been dropped as well for other upcoming speaking presentation. But I'll hand it back to Jamie to close us out. And thank you again, panelists all, for joining.
Thank you so much to Matt, to Mayor Teague, to Mayor Nierenberg, and to Lan Rao. I know that I learned a lot in that conversation. I just put a link in the chat to the collection of resources that we have on the Local Infrastructure Hub website about electrifying your fleet. That also includes a write-up from a tech and innovation session that we had that really focused on the workforce elements here, which we heard from Paul, and we heard from, I think, all the cities. There's a real transition that we need to do with our workforce, and there's money available. And one of the things that FTA is looking at as it reviews applications is how you're thinking about that workforce element. So we encourage you to check out those resources. There's also, just wanted to note that there's an optional notice of intent to apply for the Clean Ports program that is due March 28th, 2024. And I'm sure many of you know this, but there's inland ports, there's dry ports. And so we want to make sure that cities that might not be as obvious because they're not, big coastal ports, are thinking about their inland port infrastructure and applying for these programs. We know that that's a focus for EPA. Lastly, we have a session tomorrow. I referred to it in the chat earlier with respect to thinking about Vision Zero. It's about the technology that we're seeing show up in Safe Streets and Roads for All planning grants, how can you get more accurate, more efficient data about your what's happening at your most dangerous intersections? And so we're going to be talking with some of the cities who are planning on integrating some of this technology. So I'm going to drop the link in the chat so you can register for tomorrow's session. We are also going to be, our next big session is going to focus on the bridge program. As many of you know, the bridge NOFOs are actually on a sort of rolling timeline. And so some of you might be cramming to get your applications in right now. The next big deadline comes in October. So we want to help you get prepared for bridges. And we're going to be hosting a boot camp on that. So, so stay tuned for more information. And last but not least, I just want to thank all of our partners that we do this work with, and all the partners who are not listed here, Electrification Coalition, and all the subject matter experts who we rely on. As Paul talked about, we're generalists here in this space, so we rely a lot on the experts to bring you great content. And I hope that you all got a chance to fill out the poll and let us know what you want to see more of. Thank you so much, and hopefully I'll see you tomorrow.